We're here on another episode of the Brick and Mortar Podcast. I'm joined here by my co-host Nick Hill, as well as Elton Ash and Christopher Alexander from Remax Canada. So we'll start off. If I could just have you guys introduce yourselves. We'll start with Christopher. If you could go ahead, and then we'll have Elton follow.
Sounds good. Yeah, Christopher Alexander, president of Remax Canada.
Elton Ash. I'm the executive vice president for Remax Canada, and I've been in the business about 40 years, and looking forward to chatting.
Nice. So I'd say, combined between the two of you, obviously have a lot of experience and insight on what's going on in the market right now in Canada. And I think we've almost reached a global context of where everybody's sort of looking at what's going on here and trying to figure out what it means. From 30,000 feet, what are you telling agents who work for your business? What are you telling general consumers? What are you telling the media? What's the narrative of the conversation around Canadian real estate? And Elton, if you want to start off.
Well, yeah, I mean, to use the overworked adjective, unprecedented and never before seen market conditions that we've been seeing really since August 2020. For the first time, we're in a market that's truly national in nature. I mean, historically, the Rocky Mountains may divide the market in Western Canada between British Columbia and Alberta, or, what goes on in the Maritimes from Central Canada or Quebec, which is always in a world of its own. But, this is the first time from coast to coast to coast that this market is truly national and really, short supply across the board.
Right. Yeah, it does seem like low supply is the conversation happening at a national level. Does the data reflect that? And we'll lead into the report that you guys have released recently that sort of analyzes the differences that are happening between more entry level markets versus luxury. But are you seeing, you guys probably would have some of the best, most robust real estate data in the market. Is that showing up? Is that visible in real estate data across the country? Is there a lot of migration, between micro markets, et cetera?
Well, the Canadian Real Estate Association released a report last month that showed there's less than 2 months of inventory across the country.
Right.
And the general rule of thumb or indicator is you don't really get into buyer's market territory until you're over 6 months of inventory. So, for there to be a big swing in the marketplace, we need a significant amount of supply. And I mean, the headlines and the reality is we have a significant supply shortage challenge on our hands. And only now in recent months have governments been taking that seriously.
Right.
And so we got a lot of catch up to do as a nation to be able to keep up with the demand that we foresee for the foreseeable future.
Right. And hooked with that, of course, is the affordability issue, for all Canadians, whether you're a first time home buyer or a move over buyer, empty nester, or looking at moving out into something different as you age. And governments have looked at trying to tax their way out of a problem, and British Columbia sort of led that with a foreign buyer tax that was brought in, what they felt would cool the demand side. And of course it didn't, because it was only a small segment of the entire market, less than 2%. I mean, this is a made in Canada situation where COVID exacerbated the supply side even greater than what was initially developing prior to COVID. I mean, this has been a long-term trend.
Right. On that note, because Ontario followed about a year later with the non-resident speculation tax, and I know we didn't want to touch on politics too much, but hypothetically, because I think you're starting to see a lot of these research proposals, Generation Squeeze and CMHC, thinking about potentially doing a wealth tax or a property tax. I've guessed that I think we'll see potentially a national land transfer tax. It would be the place where they will try to hit it rather than, going after people's unrealized gains. Most of the experts that I'm speaking to in the real estate space, and I have a really awesome panel actually tonight and every Thursday night on Twitter. Like last week, Ben Rabideau was speaking as an example and talking about the supply challenges that you guys were mentioning. Do you think that the big vulnerability in the industry right now or in prices holding is when you start to hear off-seat commenting on prices could come down? Does that mean that they're potentially, telling people to brace for some regulation? Do we think that we're actually going to see at a national level this ban on foreign buyers? Like, where do I guess you guys are probably involved in those conversations that are happening at a political level. What's the likelihood from your perspective of these policies?
Well, I think the louder the noise gets from the consumers and the people, that's what concerns me is in the past, that's really when the government have made decisions to make moves on either taxing or fair housing plans. But, I'm convinced now, having, gone through a couple of these cycles, it's just compounding our supply challenges because specifically land transfer tax, even some of the foreign buyers tax that are all aimed at curbing demand. It's causing home sellers to rethink moving because of the costs associated with buying a home,
right,
that are over and above what the home itself is listed for. And so I think a lot of Canadians are looking at that and saying, gosh, I'm going to throw away like $100,000 just on taxes. I'd rather spend that $100,000 redoing my kitchen or putting an addition on. And so I think that's where the government and policymakers really miss the mark, is they don't consider the compound effect on the purchasers who are already homeowners.
And it's a good point, Christopher, because what ends up happening is that, in addition, is this black hole of government revenue that occurs, and no transparency. Transfer tax, great idea if it truly did something, I suppose, to address supply side, but it's not going to. It just disappears, and politicians look at re-election. They don't have a tendency to look at long-term vision, and that's the frustration I think all Canadians feel, just in general. So yeah, it's a complex situation. There's no question to that. All three levels of government have to be involved: municipal, provincial, federal, and there has to be some vision to it.
So I guess that's the real question is what's the vision? What's our exit strategy out of the, and Dan and I talk about this all the time. Obviously, I'm sure both you gentlemen, this is a daily conversation. I mean, but you guys are in the business of selling and marketing houses. My personal opinion, I'd love to get your insight on this, is that not the only, but one of the main factors that's going to help us out of this situation we've created for ourselves is incentivizing development and increasing density. Now, Chris, are you also from Vancouver? You're also in BC?
No, I'm based in Toronto.
Okay, so perfect. So we got Vancouver and Toronto here. I know that legislation just passed that now laneway homes are fully legal across Toronto. I'm hoping to see that spread in the secondary and tertiary markets, and I really see that if we can incentivize development, and especially incentivize development again in these, I can't think of anything in Vancouver, but in BC, but in the Peterboroughs and the North Bays and the Sudburys, that we can get those to become more major epicenters and then have the trickle down effect in those rural areas. That to me is a step in the right direction, maybe not the way out, but it seems to be a productive step in the right direction. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, Nick, you're speaking my language. I think we got to find a way to take the pressure off Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. We have seen a lot of, I'm calling it the great migration across Canada. People are moving to other provinces. Remote work has really helped that. It's debatable how long those remote positions will remain in effect. But, you mentioned a city like Sudbury, big population. It's got a wealth of amenities as far as, recreational activities you have your fingertips on. It's very affordable. Sure, it's really cold, but it has potential, to be another hub. And, Regina, Winnipeg, Calgary is seeing a big resurgence right now. Atlantic Canada has been rediscovered in a big way. And I think we need some short-term and long-term goals to tackle the supply challenge. And I think one of the short-term can be attract people or even incentivize them to go to different parts of the country where it is more affordable to take some pressure off our big cities.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, especially in the context of not only regional migration, but Canadian immigration, and trying to figure out a way to stack the labor market properly as well. You see all these advertisements for Nova Scotia trying to bring in tradespeople and take them from Ontario, and I've seen so many people moving from, like, I'm an hour north of Toronto, so in a small town, there's a lot of people in the trades, and we're seeing a lot of people move out of areas like that, rural GTA areas or suburban GTA areas, into or all the way out of the province into the especially Eastern Canada, like you're talking about. The question becomes, like, when you think about the context of Toronto or Vancouver, I think would be a good one as well. You're starting to face challenges like NIMBYism, challenges like bottlenecks in the supply pipeline. Like we've understood, and the tax component that you mentioned is really interesting to me. Like that's a big dissuasion for people thinking about selling, that if the government's going to add more tax, the cost of selling becomes so bad that it kind of explains to me why we're not seeing supply in the resale market. In the new construction market, we're building faster than we've ever built in the GTA. And realistically, even if you can get something approved, there is obviously a bottleneck on the planning side, but even if you can get something approved, you're in order to be the guy who's getting the trades faster than anybody else, the costs that you're paying, like we're seeing cost inflation in the major Canadian markets that's completely, to use the word again, unprecedented, right? How do we keep housing affordable without either bringing in a ton of trades as our primary migration targets into these areas? Where's the, I guess there's probably no silver bullet, but if there was one, where do you see it being to address this supply challenge?
Well, and it's interesting, when laneway homes has been approved as a method to increase supply, but if it's going to take 4 years to get it approved,
right, and it's only one unit, right? You might as well spend 4 years getting a high rise approved.
Exactly. So it's challenges all across the board here, and inflation is going to add to that. That we're now experiencing the cost to build, supply side shortages, the supply chain, and all that sort of thing. And so, we're talking a lot of, I suppose, negative influence, but on the other hand, there's huge positive influence as well, because, and we just released the luxury home market report that you alluded to briefly earlier on. And what we've really seen in that report is Canadians, of course, no matter what the price point is, believe in home ownership. I mean, we have a 68% ownership ratio in this country, and that we as Canadians see home ownership as equity and a safe investment environment that we can actually use personally. And so there is a positive side to all of this when we get into the housing discussion about the core Canadian belief in real estate ownership.
Right.
The other thing we have to accept too is that Toronto and Vancouver have really become international hubs, and they are very desirable places to live. And if you compare them, and I think you can actually legitimately include them in the conversation with cities like New York and Paris, and I mean, we've got a ways to go as far as our own maturity in, a lot of development is so recent, but amenity wise, we've got it all in those two cities, and in all of the best cities in the world, prices are really, really high. And the other thing is we've got to stop sucking and blowing on what we want. Like, if we want affordable housing, we're going to have to make some really tough decisions. And NIMBYism is a tough one that we're all going to have to probably accept in some shape or form, because we're just continuing to put Band-Aid solution after Band-Aid solution, and then it's just been this compounding cycle. And then you throw a pandemic in there, where the only thing people can do is buy real estate. You get this perfect storm of price appreciation and frenetic market activity.
Right. Yeah, I'd actually seen, I joked, that the most recent lockdown was really just, to boost house prices because, it's exactly what they do. And even funnier on the NIMBYism topic, like I'm not sure if you guys saw the Margaret Atwood thing. Like Canada's most famous author is now like a famous NIMBY on Twitter. She was like literally engaging with planners in the GTA over some construction proposal in the annex. So it's just such an interesting thing that people outside of the scope are. It's like all we talk about here, right? That this housing problem. Back on that report that you had mentioned. To me, the interesting thing is that table that you have that is growth of unit sales over $1 million. And I don't know if I'm reading this figure correctly, but it looks like St. John was up 1,400%. So I guess that's a 14x increase. And so are we seeing, when you talk about the Canadianization of this market and COVID maybe causing some people to and work from home spreading, like is the concept of luxury, are we almost seeing what's happening in the US maybe where people are like going in and telecommuting, or you're seeing satellite offices set up and people are going to pick off, especially these luxury products, going to get a better quality of life? Is that becoming one of the more primary reasons that people move now?
Well, COVID's really been the story of everybody wants a bigger house.
Right.
And, you see those numbers in St. John. A lot of that is driven by people from Ontario and BC, mostly Ontario, that have cashed out on tremendous equity and they're used to a competitive marketplace. So when they go out and, to the Atlantic provinces and they're in competition with other buyers that are not used to, or can't stomach paying more than, a couple percent over ask, and then they come in and drop like 5 to 10% over, it stimulates market growth, and they're comfortable with it because, let's say they sold their house in Toronto for 2.5 million and they're mortgage free, and the house in St. John, which is luxury, is $1 million. You might be willing to spend $1.1 million and it's worth it. So it's interesting trend we're seeing.
Yeah,
That's where it gets back to this national market that we now see. So these influences are being felt in smaller markets that were more normal and large.
And I think on those 2 points, yeah, the national market, it is national, but it's very disjointed because it's very subjective, right? We look at luxury, and I just had a realtor friend post this the other day, which was on Instagram, which was quite funny. It was a $1.5 million essentially tear down in Hamilton and a $1.5 million beautiful lodge outside of Alberta. So what is luxury? You know what I mean? If it's 1.5 million, and I mean, I remember a day when, a long time ago where I thought $1 million for a house was a lot of money. And, I see houses that are going for nowhere near what they're actually worth in the GTA. And I'm wondering if those trends, like obviously, for instance, Hamilton, we've seen outrageous growth there. I have many people that I know that invest in that have pulled out refinances that are just ridiculous. They're walking away with like $500,000 checks from the bank. Is that happening in Alberta, or is that $1.5 million place priced properly? And the single family in Hamilton, is that just way more affected because of its surroundings and its geographic location?
Yeah, and pricing is always a function of supply, demand, and geography, location. And when we look at Alberta, I mean, they went through 7 years of down cycle economic conditions when the oil price collapsed. And it's only in the last year that they've seen any amount of appreciation to pricing. And so that was an outside market influence, so to speak, that the rest of the other Newfoundland, of course, experienced the same conditions. And so you're going to see price depreciation, and now they're trying to play catch up. And of course, Calgary provides great lifestyle, and so that demand has been increasing, and now they're suffering supply side, which after 7 years of way too much supply is a totally different cycle to be in. And so, yeah, you still get local influences as to where pricing is going to go.
Right. And sorry, Chris, did you have something to say there? You wanted to add?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Curiously, how much when we talk about especially like the luxury element of, where the entry level ends and where this sort of like luxury concept starts, because it's obviously it does vary a lot region to region. How much is of a role does something like the cutoff of CMHC insurance play in this? And maybe talking a little bit about the conversation around whether or not Justin Trudeau is going to deliver on that promise to increase from 1 million to a $1.25 million cutoff on insured mortgages. Like, does it seem like there's a lot of volume, in the below $1 million market, or there's more demand? It appears to be that way, at least in the GTA, for entry level product. But like, how much of a role do you see policy playing in what determines, where the entry level ends and where sort of maybe your second or third or luxury product begins, especially in markets maybe outside of the GTA or greater Vancouver area?
Well, I think when it comes to luxury, you have to really consider the pedigree portion. You mentioned the $1.5 million dump in Hamilton versus the lodge in Alberta, or what about the $1 million condo in the Four Seasons Hotel in downtown Toronto? I mean, $1 million is well below average in Toronto, but that's a luxury property because of it's attached to the Four Seasons. So I think, at least in my opinion, pedigree is really the ultimate indicator of where luxury really starts. And as far as policy goes, it's my experience with it is every time the government introduces, it has more adverse effects than was planned, and that the positive effects that it has are always short-lived. And even the most recent fair housing program in 2017 and some of the speculation taxes that have been introduced, it hasn't stopped the market. And just going back to what Elton said earlier too, is that Canadians really believe in home ownership, and they believe in the value and the equity gains and the long-term health and opportunities that home ownership provides. And that's not going to change just because of some government policy.
Right. Yeah, I think it is an interesting note in that respect. When you talk about all of these things and combining the factors that are going on, what do you think the biggest trends are to watch for Canadian real estate right now? Like, what are you guys paying attention to? What are you advising agents? What kind of things are you studying to deliver data to agents who work under the RE/MAX brand to give them an advantage in the market? Be it on the policy side or on the on just market data side.
And if I could just jump in, that was actually my next question. So I'll just kind of piggyback that off Dan's and say, yeah, I'd really, Dan's an agent. I'm on the mortgage side of things. We've seen multiple people, even just this week, I've had clients, all my clients have gone in over asking. They've all lost it. We've lost every deal this week. What are you advising? Yeah. What are you advising your agents? What's the strategy to deal with a market like this? And how do you protect your clients?
Yeah, patience. It's frustrating as all out, as you just described, a situation that is common, which is very unfortunate because it just adds stress to the whole scenario, and right from the consumer to the agent representing them. And I mean, yeah, from a seller's perspective, what a great position to be in, but nevertheless, it's a relative thing, because they'll majority of time be on the other end of that teeter-totter. As soon as they sell the home, they'll be in that situation. And so it ultimately it's all about market knowledge, using technology. And in the real estate industry, the one thing that COVID really brought about was this huge pivot to the use of technology and enabling buyers to see property without physically going into the property initially, through virtual tours and that sort of thing. And the industry really has been historically a slow adopter to using technological tools. And so the big swing that we've seen from our membership and from the industry across the board is the use of these kinds of tools to make it easier, to make it for lack of a better description, more comfortable, instead of jumping in a car and looking at 30 homes when supply was higher. You can't do that no matter what nowadays. but it's also a cycle and it will change. But I think that's where our advice has really been is, you know, using technology, being there, being patient, and just being transparent with what market conditions are.
Yeah, I love that, and I see that, and it's funny. Even so Dan and I actually both have commercial real estate backgrounds before we went on the residential sides of things, and a construction background as well. And all three of those industries, or all those industries, are just have always been, you know, very slow adopters, archaic in a lot of ways. So totally agreed. I think COVID was a bit of a blessing in disguise, but I also think it was kind of funny because for me, it illustrated the fact that realtors and mortgage brokers and anyone involved in that process as a person is more necessary than ever before. When, you know, before it was, oh, we don't need realtors, I'll just get a computer to do it. You know, we don't need a mortgage agent, the bank, or an app or whatever, someone can do it. But now, since everyone's working from home and I want to go look at 10 houses, or I need a house inspection for a long distance real estate investment, any of that, you know, I haven't met half my mortgage clients unless I'm on Zoom. They don't even know I have this mustache. You know what I mean? Like it's really gotten from an industry you know, people were worried that we might be ushered out. I think we've kind of been ushered back in, and it's maybe showed more value on that side of things with the technology integration.
I think technology's big opportunity to usher us out was the pandemic, and in my opinion that's gone. Like,
Yeah.
I think that really solidified our role in facilitating the transaction and managing the emotion.
Yeah.
You know, it's such a hard thing, even on the mortgage side. I mean, there's a lot of real estate transactions for the average person don't happen consistently. People don't buy houses like they hail taxis or order food. It's
Right.
every 5 to 7 years typically. And so much changes over that 5 to 7 years. So unless you're working with somebody that's full-time and doing it day in, day out, you don't have the savvy to know how to, you know, get a deal done, or manage the frustration, or, you know, if something goes wonky between sale and closing, and figuring that out. It's just not in the scope of most people's world. And I think, you know, as you said, Nick, like, technology's been a big blessing, and Zoom really forced the industry to get up to snuff on it in a big way. And it's really improved the lives of everybody involved. So
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's a huge piece to take away from it, is the work-life balance of realtors has improved immensely as a result of this. I really believe. I know there are a lot of buyer agents right now are really suffering, but if you can figure out a way to become efficient, and be it through digital showings or whatever it is, or, you know, having templated boilerplate offers that are easier to send and whatever it is, I think a lot of the efficiency and technology has done well. I'd agree with your comment about sort of like the Uberification of real estate. When people talk about the finality of what it would look like if realtors were erased by computers, I actually think we're already seeing what that looks like, you know, and I think the Uberification of real estate is a declining fee environment. You can go find a discount agent who's presenting themselves as an app, and like, there's enough of them out there. And the reality is they take a very small portion of the market share. And the more that the market becomes competitive, you know, today's market, the more you need critical thinking that an app is never going to be able to do, right? You need somebody who is reading every single article that's coming out about whether price could go up or down, what downside risk is present in the market, what the Bank of Canada might be doing. And the stakes are higher than ever as well. People don't want an app to be handling their biggest. And I 5 years ago, I was trying to be the guy to create that thing. But the reality is, I don't think that's the direction. I agree with you. I don't think it's the direction. It's too complex. And until we've fully commoditized housing,
and we've talked about government policy, right? And this is an ever increasing complexity, as just said. It's not easy when you only do something once every 5-7 years to understand all this complexity, and then getting through all the requirements, whether in money laundering and home inspections, borrowing the capital, all the requirements. I mean, it is a very complex transaction that that people rarely do.
Right. Yeah, I would agree. And tax implications too. Like you see investors and like I've got experienced investors who don't even understand on their exit what the capital gains exposure is. Right. And it's like, because it's all really confusing stuff and you can't be distilled down into one single thing. I think there were a couple of things that I guess we talked a little bit about the election, like, how housing was such a hot topic. And now, again, we acknowledged prior to this conversation that the conservative leadership is having a bit of a shakeup. So it'll be interesting to see leading into the next, election cycle, how much more housing becomes of a conversation. Do you think that there's anything between now and when that election happens that's really going to be done to solve this problem? Like, I know we discussed supply side. Think we'll see any demand side policy, any taxes, et cetera. Like I know we ultimately arrived at the supply, but is there any threat there?
I'm really curious to see if consumer fatigue might set in at some point this year.
Right.
Like there is a natural ebb and flow to the market that happens. I mean, it happens throughout the year in a typical cycle, right? I mean, spring market's usually the busiest. And it slows down a little bit through the summer and then it ramps up in the fall and then winter is typically slower. I'm just curious to see if we face a bigger consumer fatigue towards the end of the year because of the level of competitiveness. But it just goes back to how much Canadians believe in the value of home ownership. And I just don't see that changing long term. So as long as buying power is strong, and interest rates rise gradually, I think, we're going to have strong market fundamentals. And that's the other thing that nobody talks about with rising interest rates is we've had this stress test in place for the last 4 years,
right?
Which was to accommodate for a rise in rates, and rates dropped below that starting point for most people. So I don't see it having too big of an effect on the marketplace.
Right.
Also, I mean, just to add on that, we're also seeing the greatest transfer of wealth right now. And on the financing side, there's more investors buying property than ever before. We see more loans for investors than ever, as well as the average. And don't quote me on this because I'm probably going to get it wrong, but I believe the average gift is between $150,000 and $200,000.
Yeah, I think Ben Powell said it was like 180,000. I think it was
169 or 189 or something. That's why I just ballparked it there.
I heard 300.
Yeah.
Oh. in the GTA, apparently.
I'm talking to the wrong people.
Yeah, you got the wrong parents.
Bank of mom and dad is stronger than ever, and
exactly.
That transfer of wealth, look at the millennial Gen Z demographic. Of course, the millennial demographic is larger than the baby boom demographic. And we always refer to the pig and the python and the economic influence that the boomers had. Now the millennials are going to be that economic influence going forward, and they're receiving in a lot of cases a large yes that they'll use wisely. At least I'm hoping my daughters will.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you think about it, back when those boomers were buying their first houses, they were probably half of the amount that they're now gifting their generation, right? The millennial generation to even buy that house. And that's not even buying it. That's just a down payment. So it's really interesting to see. And again, we can go back to where that leads. But, obviously I'm very bullish on the Canadian housing market as well. I'm bullish on housing in general. I'm an investor. I'm in the mortgage space. We have this podcast. I don't think it's going anywhere. I think there will be, just to Christopher's point, I think there will be some little bit of buyer fatigue because there has to be, just like with anything. I'm sure we're all hard workers here, and after working hard from 10 12 hours 15 hours a day for a couple of weeks, you probably need a vacation. And I think Canada is probably going to take hopefully a little bit of a vacation from the extremely hot real estate market. And by vacation, I don't mean it stops. I mean it slows down to a point where it's still a crazy market, but it's a little more manageable, and we're not seeing things go $300,000, $400,000, $600,000, $700,000 on a place listed at $999,000. We're not seeing 30, 40 offers on a one
I
bedroom.
feel like that part's also a necessary price discovery that needs to happen, and maybe the blind bid thing that the liberals talk about. Like that's something that, like, I mean, it's a whole different issue. And I'd love to actually get your guys' perspective on it. But like the you know the insanity of underpricing that happens in the GVA and the GTA. What are your thoughts there?
I think it's, I think two things. One, it's an easy tactic to employ or strategy to employ.
Oldest trick in the book.
Yeah, and it's as a seller, that's your right.
Yeah.
And I think that's not talked about enough. And what I'm sort of concerned about is that the government isn't considering the rights of I think from my perspective, it's kind of like what Nick and I were talking about earlier, is there's still affordable cities in Canada.
Yeah.
And we're somebody had mentioned, I forget who it was, but we're like 20 years behind on our supply challenge.
Yeah.
And so in the short term, if we can find ways to get people excited about Winnipeg and Regina and St. John's and St. John, like New Brunswick as a whole, parts of Alberta, and other.
Heck, I grew up in Saskatchewan. It's a great place, and Saskatchewan's great.
And they're getting rid of COVID rules too. So
There was an article recently, I think, that Saskatoon's the most traveled to place. I don't know, like I'll pull it up, but I mean, you got that, the Paris of the Prairies, right? I would say, I mean, I'm gonna be honest with it. I said this to Nick a while ago, like Toronto's my least favorite Canadian city. I'm just here because the most money is to be made here, but that's changing too, honestly.
yeah. So I think the average sale price in Winnipeg is just under 300,000, at least last time I looked at it. So
I mean, that's a parking.
there's a lot of
spot.
culture and arts and amenities and great things to do in Winnipeg. So
Yeah.
that to
I'm
me
like
is
that, and
conclusion.
I talk a lot about investment on a national level for young people. Like I would say the majority of my clients are millennial investors looking to build a portfolio, right? And some of the places that I was sending people, I mean, Nick and I actually originally connected talking a lot about Cornwall, Ontario, which to me is a great opportunity because it's an hour from Montreal, an hour and a half from Montreal, hour and a half from Ottawa, which is now, that's an average commute to Toronto, really, like right now, I would say. And
Yeah.
which is crazy, right? So to me, it's like this sentiment is only going to, Toronto will continue to grow. Toronto is nothing's going to happen there, but other places are going to start growing as well. When you talk about, we've got this huge inflow of, your 400,000 people a year, potentially 500,000 people a year. They're all going to land in Toronto. They're going to look at prices. They're going to look at wages, and they're going to be like, I'm getting out of here, right? I can't stay here. The economics don't work. Either they're maybe leaving Canada, maybe they're going back home, maybe they're going to a different place, or maybe they're going to go to, like you say, another city. That's why I'm especially bullish on places that aren't Toronto, and especially in the suburban GTA. I think there's a lot of downside risk in pricing in the suburban GTA right now.
Yeah, Dan, I mean, it's the same thing we always say, it's a drive to the qualify market right now.
Drive to qualify. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I was, I own a few properties, and I drove from Toronto to Peterborough, where I was able to afford my first duplex. And then Peterborough went up 30% in a year, and I kept on driving, and I drove another 3 hours to Cornwall, where I own 2 duplexes. And now that market's gone up drastically. And a lot of the homeowners there are freaked out because, they bought their home for less than 100,000 or maybe 100,000. I mean, I still think it's probably, there was a year and a half ago, there was a place there for sale for 90 grand, and I couldn't believe it. And just to see something for under 100,000 in Ontario just blew me away. And still, Cornwall's not a speck on the map. I mean, it kind of is, but it's right on the river. It's right on the border. As Dan said, you're close to 2 major cities. So I think those are areas where people should start focusing, is do your research, start driving, and find a nice little town and start having kids there.
Well, I think the investment thesis of places that boomers are going to want to retire to, because to me, that's the next big buyer group. That's the next big migration, right? And a lot of them aren't selling. They're keeping their houses, and some people can say that's selfish behavior of them, but to me, baby boomers are really where they're going is the next big question in the market, I think. Anything you guys wanted to add before we wrap up here?
I think as we've mentioned earlier a couple of times, Canadians believe in real estate ownership. Where there's challenge, we rise up to the challenge, and that will be the case as it always is, and that everything is cyclical. I mentioned at the start, I've been in this business 40 years, and I've seen 5 major cycles,
Right.
go both ways here. And it's going to happen again. We don't know when, we don't know why, we don't know how, but it's going to happen. And so, real estate is a safe haven investment. It'll go up and down. Stock market's crazy, sawtooth. You never know what's going on. You can live in your investment when you're in real estate. So, or use it as you've mentioned with duplex and other investments. So, I think that's where it's at for Canadians.
Yeah.
Great.
I think there's only one time in Canadian history since they've recorded house prices where your house would have been worth less after a 5-year mortgage term. And I believe it was from 89 to 94. So, a pretty good track record. I would agree that, in the fullness of time, I think you're safe here.
Chris, anything from you?
Yeah, I think long, long term, the prospects for Canada are really good. Even just based on the population growth projections, that's going to drive a lot of economic stimulus on its own. This run we're on right now is just, it's not going to continue, can't last forever. We're not going to see 18% year over year increases forever and ever. That would just be foolish. But long term, which real estate investing is, home ownership is, I think we're in for some pretty solid years. And what I'm hopeful for is that with continued migration, we are going to get to see some diversification in the economy. And I also hope that some entrepreneurial spirit comes out of this, and that we do start to see people that move from, Greater Vancouver to Saskatchewan, start a new business, which employs a lot of people, which will continue to attract more and more people to those areas. So I guess that's a long way of saying I'm bullish on Canada.
Good. It's nice to hear it. I can be too cynical sometimes, so I really like to hear it.
Dan and I have a bad cop thing going on.
Yeah.
It's okay.
I'm really glad we had this conversation. It was super insightful.